Alrighty guys, I hold a very strong and potentially controversial belief that reviews and buying guides do not properly prepare you to get into backcountry gear, especially if you don't know what you're already looking for. So today in this video, I want to break down all of the complicated mechanisms that go into backcountry bindings in order to keep you safe in the simplest terms possible. And then I'm going to go through a bunch of different variations on backcountry bindings that the industry has come up with, so that by the end of this video, you A, know a lot more about backcountry bindings, and B, know exactly what you're looking for. Let's get into it.
My name is Nathan Sayer. I'm a professional backcountry skier, photographer, and filmmaker. As part of my job, I get to test out a lot of cool gear. So today, we're covering everything that you need to know about backcountry bindings.
Alrighty, so let's get right into it with the different mechanisms that go into these bindings. And we're going to start off with the two most important criteria to look at when evaluating any binding, whether it is alpine or full tech. And that's going to be your release mechanisms. Now, every single binding is designed to release in two ways. And that's going to be your lateral release out to the side and your vertical release up. These are the mechanisms that prevent your legs from getting injured and allow the ski to eject in case of an accident.
Oh, you okay?
Now, where the lateral release is located is going to be the biggest difference between backcountry bindings and downhill bindings. And when people talk about the safety of a binding, this is often one of the biggest factors that they're looking at. But the different location of that lateral release is not always better in one situation than the other. So let's talk about that. With a typical downhill binding, your lateral release is going to be located in the toe here with these wings opening in order to let your toe rotate out. And the vertical release is going to be located in the heel here, allowing the heel to pop up in case tension is pulled. All right. Now, this setup is best set up to protect your tib-fib from fractures while sacrificing a little bit of ACL safety. Now, in our tech bindings, we see something a little bit different. Our vertical and lateral release is going to be located in the heel piece, with the heel piece rotating off to the side in order to allow it to pull out to the side, and popping up through the U-springs in order to allow for a vertical release. Now, with this setup, you're more safe against ACL tears. However, if enough force is applied into the toes without allowing for a lateral release in the back, you can generate enough force in some bindings to see tib-fib fractures. And this is one of the reasons that tech bindings are considered less safe. However, there is a trade-off. And so when you're looking at different bindings, even weirder variations of either backcountry or alpine binding that have different lateral release locations, it's important to know that there's pros and cons of each. And while it is not necessarily less safe to have one versus the other, there is a different mechanism of release that protects different parts of your legs, and each one serves its own purpose and is also paired to the use case that we see it in. Okay, so vertical and lateral release are by far one of the biggest criteria that we can look at to kind of evaluate any binding and understand how it's going to function. But those two systems don't exist within a vacuum. And so the next thing that we should talk about is going to be elasticity and forward pressure. So forward pressure is more often referred to in the context of an alpine binding, but is something that we're starting to see more often in hybrid variations of touring bindings. And what that is this heel piece here is actually spring-loaded forwards and backwards in order to consistently apply pressure through the boot into the front of this heel piece, so that no matter how much this boot flexes, there is always going to be the same pressure between this point in your heel here and this point in your toe here, enabling a very, very consistent release pressure, even when the ski is flexed or at weird angles. All right, now this is a critical component in order to keeping any binding safe, and it's something that we're going to often see lost when we go to backcountry setups. And this is one of the biggest reasons that backcountry setups are going to be generally unsafer, but more and more brands are coming up with solutions in order to introduce consistent forward pressure on backcountry bindings. And we're going to take a look at some of the bindings that actually showcase that later in the video. Now, the next term that I referenced is going to be elasticity. Now, elasticity is also something that we have lost in most traditional tech bindings, but it's something that more brands are working to introduce, and it's something that is critical when talking about rideability and safety. Now, elasticity is going to be the amount of play in the binding before ejection. Now, when riding rough, hard terrain like ice and chop and stuff, this elasticity will allow the binding to soak up more of that energy and wiggle a little bit more before full ejection. Now, in order to maintain a constant ejection force for safety, it's critical that a binding, once it ejects, it fully ejects, which is why we see that distinct snapping noise when we play with our bindings, all right? However, there are often times, especially while skiing icy chatter or carving on hard groom, that you really don't want a binding to eject, even if it's experiencing large amounts of force. Now, elasticity allows for that smaller amount of chatter to be absorbed into the DIN springs before reaching that break point where it fully ejects. Now, with a tech binding, we lose a lot of that elasticity. So when we talk about tech bindings being less safe, two of the biggest reasons for that are A, we lose forward pressure, meaning that there is an inconsistent amount of force between this point and this point as the ski flexes and the distance becomes shorter or longer. But we also lose the elasticity in the amount of play before a boot fully ejects. And that can cause premature ejection, but it can also result in us often locking out toes or cranking DINs to an unreasonable point, and then when we need them to eject, they don't eject where we want them. So we're going to look at bindings that have tried to introduce mechanisms in order to compensate for that while still giving you the full touring experience. And speaking of the full touring experience, that's kind of the last dimension and criteria that you're going to want to evaluate any backcountry binding on. And that's going to be ease of transition. It's going to be how efficient is the touring, how effective are the lock mechanisms, how good is the binding at keeping its brakes up, stuff like how many riser positions we have and are they at heights that I would actually use. Risers are pretty critical in order to touring efficiently, and how they're placed on the ski and the heights that they're at is going to massively impact how comfortable you are on longer tours. And then beyond that, I personally like to transition without taking my skis off. So I want a binding that can go from its touring positions into its walk mode positions with the simplest action possible while being consistent and staying efficient on the uphill. So those guys are going to be the biggest criteria that we look at as we go through all of these possible variations of bindings. And that is going to be, where are our release mechanisms? How do they accommodate for forward pressure and elasticity? And then beyond that, how efficient is the binding in touring and transitions? And we're going to see a lot of trade-offs where if we favor a downhill binding, we're going to get more of that elasticity, we're going to get more forward pressure, we're going to get better release mechanisms, but in exchange, we're going to lose a lot of efficiency. And if we go to a full tech setup like this, we're going to get incredible amounts of efficiency, but we're not going to get that elasticity, we're not going to get forward pressure, and it's going to be a slightly less safe binding. Real quick, one last thing that I've realized that I should kind of cover before I get into the different setups is going to be boot compatibility as well as DIN certification, since those are two things that you will hear talked about either too much or not enough of in the industry. So starting with boot compatibility, when you get a boot with tech inserts, you can end up with a boot that is not compatible with downhill setups. Now, in order to accommodate that, it is important to look at the boot that you're getting, decide whether it's something you're going to use in both uphill and downhill setups, and then make sure that you end up with an ISO standard boot that will fit your existing alpine setups, as well as have the tech inserts needed for a touring binding. I have definitely made the mistake of picking up a boot that was not compatible with setups that I intended to run it in, and then using it for uphill and trying to fit it into a downhill binding. Now, really interesting, but this is a binding where the toe piece switches between a tech toe and a downhill toe. Now, in order to make sure that you are still able to run any touring boot that you want to on this setup, they've actually included an adjustable multi-norm standard AFD plate that rises and falls in order to accommodate different ISO standard boots. Now, this is a really cool feature, and I'm going to do a whole video on this binding as well as touch upon it later in this video. But just be aware that if you're going to use a boot for both touring and downhill, you need to get a boot that is compatible with all of your bindings, and it's worth checking that ahead of time. Okay, talking about DIN certification. All right, some tech bindings, more and more often now, are advertised as DIN compatible or DIN certified. All right, the DIN standard that Alpine tech bindings meet is not the same standard as just normal Alpine downhill bindings. It is a different ISO standard, and while it is still nice that they have done that testing and have earned that certification, the process to get a DIN certification is not exactly straightforward or something that is provided free to binding companies. It is something that they have to apply for and pay for and go through a process to do. And so it is one piece to consider on top of all of the different mechanisms that we're going to talk about in this video. But it is important to keep in mind that because a tech binding says it is DIN certified, does not mean it is as safe as an Alpine binding, because those ISO standards are different. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get into some different setups. All right, so getting into what is going to be the meat of the video, what I've got laid out ahead of me is a full spectrum of bindings, from lightweight tech bindings all the way to what I'm calling transition bindings. Now, I'm going to be talking about and showing 3 different variations of backcountry bindings, but there's also a 4th variation which I do not have here and I'm not going to talk about as much, which is frame bindings. The 3 variations that I am going to talk about are going to be your tech bindings and the 2 different styles of tech bindings, hybrid bindings, which is going to be your biggest category and largely the one that I think most people should consider, and then transition bindings, which are very quickly becoming one of my favorite categories. And if you're going to be somebody who really cares about downhill performance, is going to be an excellent option. So diving right into it, let's start with the all-in backcountry setup, which is going to be our U-spring pin bindings. All right, so I say U-spring pin bindings because there's actually 2 different variations on full tech setups, which are going to be U-spring and roller pin. And U-spring is far more common, at least in my experience, but we're also going to talk about what they've done with roller pin and kind of the benefits of that system. So going through our U-spring tech bindings, what we have here is a ultra lightweight tech toe, very common, pops up. You have a pull for walk mode and press down for release. You also have a mounting plate for your ski crampons. Coming to the back of the ski, we have our heel piece here, which is going to release both laterally by rotating as well as vertically by pulling up through the U-spring. Now, when I say U-spring, it is this solid piece of metal here that wraps around. Now, this is actually one of the biggest downsides to this setup. It is a good enough system, but it could be a better system. So in order to get a binding that adjusts and ejects at your proper force, you need to find a U-spring for your binding that is preset based on the amount of material in it to release at the specific force that is appropriate for you. But because they cannot make a U-spring for everyone, they often cover a much broader range, meaning they are less precise and less dialed in to your specific release force. Now, you may notice here that I also have an adjustable spring on the back. This adjustable spring adjusts for my lateral release, and that is going to be really the only amount of adjustment that I have on this binding. Talking about efficiency, which is going to be one of our biggest criteria, this is an extremely efficient binding. It is extremely lightweight. It is largely all composite materials. I could even make it lighter by removing the brakes. But I have a very, very simple transition mechanism. I simply rotate, step in, and I'm good to go. For touring, to swap into ski mode, I can leave my toes clipped in, rotate the heel, and step back in, and I'm ready to go. All right, this is about as efficient as it gets. You can transition this ski in 30 seconds and rip skins while it's still on your feet. Another beautiful part of this binding is I have 3 riser positions, which for me is personally a huge priority. But once I pop that down, I have my flat position, I have a mid position, which is probably the one that I use the most. And then for special occasions, I have an extremely tall upper position, which can make some of those steeper and more aggressive skin tracks way more comfortable and efficient. All right, these are kind of the criteria that I'm gonna look at with every binding, which is what is my safety, what is my efficiency, and what am I missing? So for what am I missing here, I do not have any form of a spring for forward pressure. So as this ski flexes, there is going to become a longer or shorter distance between my front and rear pins, meaning that I'm going to release at a different force, and it is almost impossible to accommodate for that. So if I was running a very soft ski with this binding is going to get much less safe very quickly. Now, the other thing that I'm losing is I do not have any elasticity. The toe piece in these offers almost no elasticity whatsoever, and the rotation mechanism here really does not have any amount of play before it ejects, and I can actually see that when sometimes I'm clipping into my boot and I apply enough pressure to just push this out very, very quickly. So overall, you have pros and cons. We have pretty good release mechanisms. We even have an AFD in there, but we do not have all of the features that you would want to see if you were somebody who is going to be prone to leg injuries or pushing the ski exceptionally hard on hard icy snow. In my testing with tech bindings, I have found that when skiing in almost a racer carve on hard chop, the vibrations coming in sideways can generate enough force to pop you out laterally because there is no elasticity, and those vibrations start to add up and can reach the breaking point at which you will release. So personally, I love these setups as somebody who does large backcountry missions, but for a lot of people who are still going to be skiing a majority resort, this setup does not make sense. All right, I love it. And if you're going after big climbs and have multiple skis, absolutely get one. If this is your one ski quiver, this is definitely not something that you're going to want to ski every single week in resort. But it has a great place and I love it, and it's one of my favorite bindings, and I have definitely pushed it outside of its comfort zone and still seen it perform consistently. Real quick, while we're still on the subject of tech bindings, this is the other variation. This is a G3 Ion. I do not believe these are still produced anymore. The difference here is that this, instead of having one continuous piece of metal for that rear spring, actually has an adjustable spring tension between the two pins, allowing you to fine-tune the vertical ejection force on this binding for your weight. Now, the trade-off to this is that you have a heavier binding with a more complicated mechanisms, but the pro of it is that because these are rolling pins with an adjustable release force, you can get a much more fine-tuned and safer vertical ejection on this binding. One thing that I did not mention on the U-spring is that because that's a fixed piece of metal, the friction between your insert and the U-spring can actually slowly wear down. And so if you're running one setup for an exceptionally long period of time, you can wear down that. And so it kind of contributes to that lack of consistency and long-term reliability. The roller pin mechanism looks to address that by having rotating pins, by having adjustable spring tension, but It is something that is much less common in my experience to see. It was common in the G3 Ion, and I'm actually not certain how many different models of this are still on the market. This is, I think, the only one that I know of, and it's discontinued. But it's something interesting to be mindful of. A very specific build to address a very niche problem. Okay, so getting into what is my favorite category, and the one that I think will fit most people the best, as well as the one which I would probably need like 5 to 10 different setups to fully showcase, but that's going to be our hybrid bindings. And that is going to be bindings that still implement traditional touring features, but have within them the downhill features in order to kind of address some of the reliability and safety concerns with a dedicated uphill tech setup. Now, to me, at least personally, the golden standard of this, or the best representation of it, is the Kingpin. Other models kind of within this category are going to be your Shifts, your Fritschi Tectons, your ATK Frees, which are super interesting binding. I would love to test if ATK wants to send one for me to make a video about. But with this, I have the exact same tech toe piece off of a full tech setup. I still have that ski crampon plate, but then the heel obviously is a very different looking heel. This one is more or less a full alpine heel, giving me adjustable spring tension both vertically on top of the ski, as well as rotating off to the side to allow the ski to eject laterally from the heel while still having an alpine heel. Now, this creates its own problems where you have to have an extremely efficient anti-friction device here and rollers here to allow that ski to eject consistently. But this addresses a lot of those concerns about consistency when ejecting from a tech insert heel, giving you a more consistent release force. And then beyond that, one of the best things about this hybrid is that it also has adjustable forward pressure. So the forward pressure on this binding is properly aligned to create consistent tension between the tech toe and the alpine heel, meaning that you're going to have much more consistent release forces on this than a full tech setup. Additionally, because we have full springs on the heel and toe, on the heel, we have elasticity play within this that allows this to lift slightly when there's tension being pulled on it, and allows it to rotate slightly to give a little bit of elasticity. And I've actually seen this where I've taken like a crash and I've almost pushed it out, but it's come back in, meaning that the heel is able to essentially rebound or have a little bit of play in it to accommodate smaller vibrations without fully kicking you out prematurely. So overall, every single hybrid is going to be very different. They all have a different approach to this. They all have pros and cons. I would say that by far my favorites at the moment are the ATK Free and the Kingpin, which I think really has proven its worth, but there's a place for all of them. I would just be careful with hybrids of how complicated the mechanisms can be. For this one, it's extremely simple. Going between ski and walk is just moving the heel slightly, but with examples like the Shift, which I really wish I could show you, it is much more complicated and prone to breakage. So be mindful when going with a hybrid, whether it leans on the side of more touring, like the Kingpin, or more resort skiing, like the Shift. And the spectrum within just this category of bindings is relatively massive. So what are some of your trade-offs? Well, we get elasticity and we get forward pressure and we get more consistent release forces, but the downside is going to be weight is a big one. You're adding a lot more weight on your heel, which means a less balanced touring ski, especially in kick turns and other things. In my experience, it's not too bad, and I'm happy to make that sacrifice to get a safer ski, but you're always going to be adding more weight as you kind of implement more features. Some Hybrids, in my personal opinion, have really bad transitions. The shift would be an example of that. I would say the usability, efficiency, and transition of a shift is not something that I would want to use consistently in the backcountry. I tend to find that it has issues either gumming up, which we had previously. I've also seen issues with the brakes staying up and small parts within the mechanism breaking. A lot of people have had ones they used for a long time, but I also know just as many people who have had to turn it into a dedicated downhill binding because mechanisms in the transition stopped working. This one offers great efficiency. I have all of the same features that I have on a tech one. I can transition with just the flip of a lever. I have an automatically locking brake, and I have 2 positions of risers, which gives me good uphill efficiency. This is where you start to decide exactly what your priorities are. For me personally, my priorities on a binding like this is that it's going to give me enhanced safety, but I'm not making sacrifices on efficiency beyond the weight. I get forward pressure, I get elasticity, and I get consistent release forces on the heel at the sacrifice of weight, but not at the sacrifice of overall efficiency. Now, there is one category that I don't have here, and I'm going to touch upon briefly, which is the frame bindings. So these are much heavier bindings where the entire toe and heel mechanism is connected by a metal frame and will lift off of the ski together so that you can tour in an alpine binding. Now, this has a very specific niche use case for people who do not have touring boots, but still want to go touring. And there are some serious downsides to that with a lack of walk mode and the mechanisms, in my experience, being breakable. However, if you really want a ski that is 99% an alpine downhill ski, but you can every once in a while go walk around the backcountry with, a frame binding is an option, is how I would put it, and they're often pretty cheap. So it's something that you can go look at. It's not something I would ever use. So I would personally avoid. I don't have any examples to show you. I'll flash some up on screen now. The downsides here are going to be weight and efficiency. Whether you are skiing in a resort or you are touring, you're going to be touring with a ton of weight. You don't likely have a touring boot to go with that then. So you are losing walk mode, meaning a much more uncomfortable tour. And overall, it's really something that I would try to avoid. But if you can't avoid it or you just want to dabble in touring, it's always an option. Getting into what has come to replace the frame bindings is transition bindings. And this is personally one of the most interesting things that I think I'm going to talk about in this video. And so much so that I plan to make an entire video about this setup in particular. But essentially, the way that a transition binding works is we have a separate part where this entire binding is going to switch from a 100% alpine orientation to a 100% or 50%, I guess, touring orientation. Now, some people love these, other people hate them. Personally, I had mixed feelings for a long time until I got to dabble with this new Tyrolia hybrid that's coming out this year, in which case I kind of changed my mind and personally now am pretty excited about these setups. So let's talk about it, because every single different aspect that we've talked about so far is going to be featured in this binding in some capacity, and the major trade-off obviously being weight. Okay, so in terms of release mechanisms, when we are in our downhill orientation, we are a full alpine binding. So we have a DIN certified to alpine standard toe and heel. We have our AFD device up front, we have our wings that pull out, we have our adjustable spring from 4 to 14, we have adjustable forward pressure in the back here, and we have an adjustable vertical release. So we have as much in the way of safety that we can get. We have as much reliability as you are going to get, we have elasticity, and we have adjustable forward pressure. So this is a binding that is offering you every dimension of safety that it can, because it is a full alpine binding. With that said, there are some trade-offs in specific orientations. So once we go to our touring orientation, we slide our toe piece on, and we are going to start to look a lot like a kingpin, to be honest, where we have a full tech toe, pops up, locks, all the goodies. Now the mechanisms for transition on this are a little bit less efficient. I have a lever here that allows me to adjust my brakes and lock those up. I then have a single riser here, and that's essentially my touring formation. It is a little bit less efficient and streamlined than I would personally like for climbing, but if I wanted something that was offering me maximum safety and I could go ski in resort in a park, but then also go have an efficient and pleasant touring experience with, this is definitely something I would consider. Now, the big discussion around these, which really started with the cast system, is what if I forget the toe piece? What if I go touring in this formation and I forget my toe piece? Because this is an extra thing that I have to carry. It's more weight in my backpack. Well, they've thought about that. With this toe piece, it can actually adjust far enough back to allow you to clip in to your heel piece, meaning that technically speaking, you could ski this as essentially a kingpin where you have a tech toe clipped into an alpine heel. Now, if you're paying close attention, you might notice that you no longer have your lateral release mechanism. So this is very much an emergency feature, but it is there to address that concern of what happens if I forget this toe piece. Now, talking about transition efficiency, because your toe is literally clipped to a piece that is going to come off, you cannot transition this while having the ski on for obvious reasons. Additionally, you have to go into your bag to pull out your second toe piece, and the entire way up, you have to carry this additional weight. So it definitely loses some points for the lack of efficiency, but there is one other feature on this that I think is extremely worth noting, which is that because this binding relies on you clicking in both as an alpine skier as well as a tech skier, you have an adjustable multi-norm standard AFD device here, allowing you to raise and lower this to accommodate any boot standard. So you could run a fully alpine setup like this with a Pomoka sole, like Scarpas and stuff that don't normally clip into alpine toes, which is a really, really nice and smart feature. There was a lot of thought that went into this, while also taking the shortcut of reusing almost all of their demo binding components. But it is an option that is out there. Who is this for? Well, this is going to be for someone who really has like a one ski quiver, but is predominantly a resort skier. If you mostly ski resort, you're traveling with a ski, but every once in a while you want to be able to go out and tour, this is a phenomenal setup, because when you're running this in resort, you are taking almost no trade-offs on your ski. You could go push this on any park feature, you could go run this down a race course, but then you could also go touring with a full tech setup. Well, 50% of a tech setup, a full tech toe. So that is a really, really cool feature, and you get every single dimension that we've talked about in this, with the exception of weight. This thing is heavy. And when you're skiing downhill, that doesn't matter that much, but on the uphill, it's pretty dang heavy. It's much heavier than even the Kingpin. And so you're getting safety, you're getting reliability, you're getting features. The downside is that you have extra weight. Alrighty, so recapping everything that we just covered, we have 4 main categories of bindings. That's going to be our tech, hybrid, frame, and transition. All right, the main criteria that we're looking at when we look at bindings starts with safety, which is going to be where are our release mechanisms, whether our lateral release mechanism is in the heel or whether that's going to be in the toe. Then how many different features do we have to supplement those safety features, such as elasticity and forward pressure? And then when we're looking at more of a backcountry binding, we're going to talk about how efficient is that binding, whether that's weight, riser positions, or transition type. With that said, who are these different setups for? So our full tech setups are going to be 90% backcountry. All right, these setups just are not as safe to run in resort, and they do not perform well in resort. If you are a high energy skier who's putting a lot of force through your ski, this binding will not be as consistent or reliable or enjoyable to ski as you would like in resort. There are safety concerns with it prematurely ejecting on hard packed icy snow when putting lots of force through it. But if you're somebody who is 90% in the backcountry, this is an incredible binding that will perform when you need it to, both uphill, downhill, at the trade-off of having less reliable release mechanisms and not performing the way that you want it to in resort. This is amazing on the uphill. It's good enough on the downhill. These are great for most people. If you're going long distances, this is what you want. On most backcountry missions, you're spending hours touring and then 30 minutes skiing. So having a setup like this actually makes a lot of sense on those days. And personally, as somebody who does backcountry films, this is almost entirely what I ski. I have done double backflips in them. I have skied them on icy couloirs. I've taken them up to unreasonable speeds on straight lines, and I have yet to have them fail, but I always know in the back of my head that there is a situation where these are not as safe as I need them to be. Hybrid setups are a little bit more complicated. This is where you can get a setup that does a little bit of both without having to worry about separate components, but every single hybrid setup is going to have its different features. Some hybrid setups will have forward pressure and elasticity, but might not have as good of transitions, and some setups will have, no elasticity, no forward pressure, but they're going to be much more efficient and lightweight. This is one that is focused more, I would say, 70-30 towards backcountry, with us still having a full tech toe. It's a little bit less reliable than a full alpine setup, but because it has forward pressure, elasticity, and a controllable heel release in both lateral and vertical orientation, this is something that's going to offer us a ton more reliability than our tech setups, at the sacrifice of adding more weight. Talking about frame bindings, that's a very niche one. If you are dabbling in the backcountry space, really don't mind the weight, or want to spend less money, frame setups are a great way to get you in early, especially buying a used one, because then you don't have to run backcountry boots, but you're making sacrifices in weight. It's definitely going to suck on the uphill not having walk mode, and overall, it's kind of a half measure to getting fully into the backcountry. Now, if you still want all of the features of a alpine binding, but you do not care about weight, let's say, then you have the transition setups. You have a fully high performance alpine binding with every single feature that you could possibly need for safety and compatibility, but at the same time, you can always transition it and then have a relatively efficient touring setup with a full tech toe and everything else that you would need to get after it. The huge downsides to this are you have to carry an extra piece that you can lose or fail, and you're going to be adding a lot of weight even in comparison to a transition. So who is this for? Well, recently I picked up a sled, and this became one of my go-to setups because I didn't have to worry about the weight, but I wanted to be able to go out and ski the biggest lines and the biggest airs that I possibly could. So I picked up this setup and I have absolutely loved it. It's also on a super unique ski, which I'll be teasing and talking about in a different video. But overall, this video serves a great role for me as somebody who travels because it's a ski that I can trust 110% in resort without making any sacrifices. But at the same time, it's something that I actually really enjoy touring on and find to be comfortable. It allows me to ski that 80-20 or 90-10, resort primary mix while also having something that I personally would take touring any day. So this one ski quiver type setup for people who are mostly in resort, and the amount of safety and reliability that you get out of it is definitely worth the sacrifice of weight when it comes to having a predominantly resort ski. Alrighty guys, so with that, that is my complete guide to backcountry bindings. If you're gonna ask me which ones you should buy, I really can't tell you. I personally would say that shifts are probably not one of my favorites. And I think that if you're trying to get a 60-40 ski, go hybrid. If you wanna go all in on backcountry, go full tech. And if you just wanna dabble and you want a ski that you can still ski comfortably at resort, go with the transition. But beyond that, specific models and stuff are going to be specific to you. You have your own price point, you have your own needs, and I just want to be able to provide the tools that you need to go buy responsibly. So with that, guys, don't forget to like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.